Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another week of Mind, Technology, and Society. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Tamsin, who is an associate professor of psychological and brain sciences at UC Santa Barbara, and whose research. Are you now? You got to update your page.
I did, sorry.
How long has it been? That long. So this is the goal. This is also a seminar, so grad students, this is the goal. No, make it such that you're so busy just doing your research and living your life that you drift into being a full professor and eventually get around to updating your page. This is the dream. Okay, so let me start over. Full professor, Tamsin hails from UCSB, and research program focuses on the development, neural correlates, and ramifications of theory of mind across many domains. And today will be talking to us about her research on theory of mind and acquired Christian beliefs about God.
Thank you. This is my first visit to Merced, and I love the campus here. It's all new. The best you can say about the Santa Barbara architecture is that it's eclectic. They build what they can afford at any given time. It doesn't have a theme. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to sharing this work. This is quite new work for me. We've just started to publish some of the work that I'll talk about. And if there's time, I'll talk about some very new stuff that we're just starting to work on. So the overview, I'm going to say just a word about why might you be interested in studying religious concepts as cognitive scientists. What's the point? You could be really interested in religion, or they could pose particular questions for representation of kinds of things. And it's really the second reason that interests me primarily. I'm going to introduce a sort of framework that was really introduced initially by people like Dan Sperber and Pascal Boyer for thinking about concepts that don't refer to unambiguously real things in the universe, concepts of things which have an uncertain existential status. There's no consensus on the existence, say, of unicorns, or vampires, or zombies, or gods for that matter, even though large numbers of people across the world believe in some or all of those kinds of concepts. They're culturally ubiquitous. And the basic idea, and I'll say a little more about this later, is that the way you might do this is by taking a familiar concept of something that does exist, or uncontroversially existing thing that may be supplied by core knowledge systems of thinking and reasoning about the world, and you modify it in certain ways to give it those different properties. And this has some consequences for cognitive science, the properties of those kinds of representations. So the idea here is that God concepts in Abrahamic Judeo-Christian religions and some other world religions co-opt the concept of a person, intentional acting agent with behavior, with beliefs, desires, motivations, and so on. And that when this happens, the person concept is activated when people who believe in God concepts reason and think about those concepts when they deploy them in reasoning. And so you can find evidence of this signature that means that these two versions of the concept can coexist and can interfere with one another. That's going to be the basic, what I'm going to try and persuade you of today. So I'll talk about some initial evidence that was the first pass at demonstrating this theory, collected by Frank Kyle and Justin Barrett and Pascal Boyer and others. Identify some problems with that methodology, and really it was the only method that existed up till recently for establishing this position. I'll talk about studies from the lab that we've done to investigate a series of questions that arise from this theory, and if there's time at the end, I'll talk about a few very new lines of work from a related idea that I'll introduce on the way. So really, the first thing, why religious concept, is exactly because they refer to things that may or may not really exist. And so they can't necessarily get their meaning from indexing that thing in the world. Like, you can't point at a unicorn and say, my concept of a unicorn is whatever that thing is. And so the idea instead is, well, a unicorn is a kind of horse with a magic horn, right? Do unicorns have hooves? Yes. Do you know that because you've read about the hooves of unicorns? Probably not. You probably just infer that they have hooves because horses have hooves. Right? That's the way this basic theory works. Okay. So starting kind of big, and I'm not going to really spend a lot of time defending this framework. I'm just going to, it's a framework that I've worked in my whole career in cognitive development, so if it's wrong, I'll be dead by the time you figure that out. The basic idea is that there's not just two kinds of knowledge, but there's at least a separation in the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of things that people can acquire and learn about. And I'm going to call one of these kinds of knowledge core conceptual repertoire. These are inferences and intuitions given to us by systems of thinking, representational systems that may have been evolved to handle adaptive problems that have been important over our evolutionary history. These may be shared with some of our common and more distant ancestor species. And there's a ton of work demonstrating that knowledge about these kinds of things emerges very early in development and unfolds over the course of life in response to environmental input. Knowledge about objects and object mechanics, when objects will fall, how far an object will go if you throw it, can an object pass through another object, and so on. Work by Starkey and Carey and others. Work about animate intentional agents, also called theory of mind. Some objects are self-propelled, they move in pursuit of goals, they have cognitive states about the world, and we can understand and predict their behavior by understanding those internal states. Natural kinds, things that exist, living things, naturally occurring objects in the world, numbers, sets of things. There have been proposals that there are core knowledge systems for all of these kinds of things, and they represent a kind of core way of us thinking about the world. Humans can also create very interesting and esoteric bodies of knowledge. Concepts like subatomic particles, the concept of an infinite universe, geological, theological processes, mythology, and the ones I'm going to talk about today, supernatural entities that are featured in many of the world's religions. These are culturally complex knowledge, and I'm going to argue that they don't arise in the same way as this first kind of knowledge, but they're built from it. So continuing with framework stuff, Pascal Boyer and Dan Stoger and others proposed that one of the ways you can create these supernatural concepts of existentially uncertain things, is by taking a familiar concept and modifying it. So the God concept, according to this view, is built from the concept of a person. God is kind of a person with extraordinary powers in the realms of psychology and perception and spatial abilities. God isn't only those things, but that's the basic definition of God according to this idea. And there's two important elements to the way this basic idea works. And that is that these concepts are called counterintuitive because the violations that you add are not things that would typically be true of the concept. So people can't know everything. People can't see everything. People can see the things that they're close enough to see or understand in the languages that they speak and understand, right? They're limited in psychological ways. They can't be everywhere at once. Some supernatural entities in religious traditions can. God can be everywhere. God can see everything. One of the ideas of the counterintuitiveness of these concepts makes them interesting. It makes them memorable. It makes you want to learn more about them, and it makes you want to talk about them to other people. And Boyer has a theory that this explains some part of some of our religious beliefs that we find across the world. Not the entire explanation, but that this is why these concepts spread so readily across people, both vertically from generation to generation and across people within a generation. The other idea, and the one I'm going to focus most of my time on, is the idea that when you create one of these explicit concepts, when you acquire one, they don't replace the core concepts that they're based on. That those are activated alongside the modified concept. And some of the inferences from the initial concept are brought to bear when you're reasoning about the theological concept, I suppose. I'm going to try and spend some time, which we've done in the lab over the last couple of years, trying to find a good way of determining whether we can find evidence for that being the case. If there's time at the end, the newer work will briefly look at a couple strands of work on the memorability and the communication and transmission of these concepts. Okay, so now you get some pictures. This proposes that there's sort of two ways that people who are believers in religious cognition, like there's believers in this notion of God. I'm going to primarily be talking about Christian participants in these studies, although in principle this could be true of other people who believe in gods that have these kind of structures. So theology says that God knows everything, right? So you might not want a tip when you buy a cup of coffee, and you might be able to convince yourself that the person who served you didn't know that you didn't tip. But God knows, because God knows everything. This you may not be able to read. This is a still from the Netflix show Narcos. I watch lots of television. Now I'm a full professor, I have time to do that. Narcos is an excellent show. There's this great scene in the second season when they're hiding out, the family, Pablo Escobar and his family are hiding out away from Medellin because they're going to be killed if they go there. And his mother is complaining that she can't go to Mass. And he replies, I'm sure that God can hear your prayers from here. Right? This idea that you don't need to be in church or close by for God to know that you pray. And the idea is that this is the theology, this is the way that we think of God as an extraordinary entity with these amazing abilities in these realms. But that intuitively, because God is based on the person content, you also think about God as a regular person as well, with person-like limitations. And so 2 examples of this. The first, I'm going to play a little video clip, if you'll forgive me, from Chris Rock, who has just a fantastic, very short bit illustrating this basic idea. So hopefully this video and sound will work. I hope it'll make it explicit.
That's okay. That's a pretty ambitious thing to say. No mistakes. You ever read the Bible? What does the Bible say happened on the 7th day? God rested. Okay. It's odd that a perfect being would rest. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been performing a task? It was going perfect, and you took a rest? Has that ever happened in your life? No! That has never fucking happened to you. What was happened to you was you were performing a task, you fucked up, and you thought, let me rest before I fuck this up some more. God doesn't make mistakes. Hush your mouth. God make plenty of mistakes. You ever see a porcupine? Can't eat it, can't hug it. It's ugly, sticky, shitting all over the place. Mistake. What about quicksand? Sand, you can drown it. You can drown dry. You think God meant to make quicksand? Mistake. You ever been to Mississippi? Mistake.
Just trying to be on the coattails of Chris Rock, so you'll enjoy the talk, because you'll remember at least that. So this is the idea, right, that God is a limited person in the same way. This is another one I wanted just to share with you. Moral return. You can't hold hands with God when you're masturbating, but presumably being omnipotent. God could hold hands with you. I thought for later. So how do we assess this claim? Do these kind of theological, religious, extraordinary agent concepts indeed coexist with a more limited personal concept on which the claim is that they're based? Are they activated at the same time? And what would constitute evidence for that? Well, up till very recently, the main piece of evidence that people have pointed to are studies that rely on kind of narrative recall, where participants are given stories that involve actions by these supernatural, extraordinary entities, and then they're asked recall questions about those narratives. Now, the narratives are constructed in such a way as to not, this is the claim, indicate any human-like limitations. But the recall tests whether or not people remember them as if God was limited when acting these narratives in certain ways. Do they mistake sentences that include the idea that God did things sequentially, even though the theology says God can do everything at the same time? Right? That's the basic idea of this kind of logic. So just to give you a flavor of it, these participants, when they're given a survey, these are religious believers, in at least some of the studies in this paper, about what is your theological belief about God's characteristics. This work has been done across a couple of different cultures and religious traditions. And these focus mostly on the psychological and spatial and physical characteristics of God. And people agree that God can read minds, knows everything, can perform multiple mental activities simultaneously, and does not need to be nearby to hear, see, smell, taste, or touch things. So that those are kind of rates of agreement in a large sample of believers when they're given a survey just asking them about their religious theology to which they're committed. People are less consistent about what they think about God's spatial characteristics are, but none of them think God can only be at one place at one time. They either think God is everywhere, is in many places at once, or is nowhere. And then similarly for occupying space, spatial physical characteristics. Some people think God doesn't occupy space. Some people think God can occupy space at the same time and place as another object. No one says that God can't be in the same place. So that's the kind of theological belief. Plenty of time to respond. It's not a recall task of any kind. They've just been asked what their beliefs are. So here's an example of one of the narratives that Barrett and Kyle use in this paper. And the idea here is it's got a lot of details, and then subsequently people are asked probe questions about sentences that might or might not repeat. And the key test here is to find ones where the sentence that's probed for indicates a limitation that God had. So in this story, it was a clear sunny day, two birds were singing back and forth to each other, they were perched on a large oak tree next to an airport. God was listening to the birds. One would sing and then the other would sing, one had a bird with blue, white, silver feathers, the other dull gray feathers. While God was listening to the bird, a large jet landed. It was extremely loud. The birds couldn't even hear each other. The air was full of fumes. God listened to the jet until it turned up its engines. God finished the birds. So a test sentence here would be, God stopped listening to the two birds while the jet was landing. Right? And people often endorsed that kind of sentence as having appeared in the story. They also did free recall, which I think illustrates the point that Barrett and Kyle are trying to make here better, with the way people just have to tell the stories back again, and they would say, these are just some examples of participants' recall. A jet came and began destroying the beauty and even took God's attention away. Right? The noise was so loud, God couldn't hear the birds. Right? God can only hear the jet until it turned off its engines. So the idea here is that people are recalling this as if God has limitations. And that's the evidence that Kyle and Barrett and others have used to argue for this activation of a person concept, the anthropomorphization of God. But you probably know some problems with this. And one of the most serious problems has been identified by Andrew Stillman down at Occidental, who's done some work on this. And he claims, and I think he's exactly right, that the participants had a lot of priming in these stories, over the course of several stories, of kind of God's human-like actions and human-like behavior. So God was described as pushing a stone, looking at the rock, listening to the birds, enjoying the smell, helping an angel work on a crossword puzzle. And the idea that Strowman is putting forward is that really the reason that people are remembering these limited ways in which God acted is because they were so primed to think of God in that way, in this particular task, that they're activating a concept of God that may not be their theological concept at all, but is a much more anthropomorphic version. And that, according to Strowman, leaves this as really not very good evidence for this coexistence hypothesis. So we had, over the course of some studies, have tried to find a better way of doing this, and it turns out that one of the methods that you can use, we think, to do this is one that was actually invented by Andrew Strowman himself, a critic of this theory, to study representational coexistence in the domain of science and intuition. So the idea here is that we acquire scientific understandings of the world as part of higher education, in this culture at least, that are somewhat, or at least in some cases, very much at odds with our earlier intuitions that we might have either acquired through core knowledge mechanisms or by very early versions of what we've learned from other people. So, for example, theory of objects that appears to be the one that infants have available to them, at least in terms of passive looking time experiments, is a kind of Aristotelian impetus theory of objects. It doesn't, for example, think that objects are made of atoms, or deal with objects moving at very fast speeds, or very, very small, or very, very large objects. Right? And so the idea here is that Strowman was testing the idea of whether or not these later acquired scientific theories replaced those initial intuitions that we have about the way the world works in several different domains of scientific knowledge. And the method he used was to have people essentially endorse or reject statements that on the basis of what's scientifically true. And these statements were organized in such a way that they should be easy or hard, depending on whether that statement included a statement about the object that was at odds with an intuition that you might have had earlier on. So, for example, rocks are composed of matter should be no problem because it's true on the earliest intuitive theory of objects, and it's true on later scientific understandings of objects. Numbers are not composed of matter, but they're not composed of matter in early theories or in the later acquired theories. The inconsistent cases, the ones with little asterisks here, are the ones where there is a difference predicted. If the intuition is not replaced by the newly acquired scientific knowledge, there's a conflict between, in a statement like fire is composed of matter, which appears true on the earliest theory, because fire looks like a substance to young kids, and they will say that it's a substance. But of course, it's not on later scientific theories, and air does not appear to be composed of matter to the young kids, because you can walk through it. Solid objects can't pass through one another, but it's true scientifically. So the idea here is that here, if the intuitive theory is activated, these are harder to perform, be less efficiently processed because of the conflict. That's the logic behind this. And across 10 different domains of scientific statements composed in this way, Strowman and his colleague Hell were able to show better performance for consistent over inconsistent statements, and faster response times for consistent over inconsistent statements. And they argue there that this is evidence that later scientific knowledge acquired in school and beyond suppresses but doesn't replace early intuitions about the world. We're going to use this logic in our study of religious beliefs. So here's a set of our statements, and I'll take you through each of these statements as a sort of trial, so you can get a sense of exactly what the participants experienced as they went through this study. The idea is to construct these statements in the same way. We have participants who are Christian believers, and they have to be at least moderately religious on a scale of the strength of their belief to be included in the study. And we construct statements and ask them to answer on the basis of what their theological belief about God is. So we're asking them, the right answer, according to the task, is whether or not their theology says this is true. And there are statements which we construct that are true on theology, but also true if God is treated as a regular person. So God has beliefs that are true, doesn't create a problem in this hypothesis, because people have beliefs that are true. So if you're activating God as a person, it shouldn't be a problem. People typically don't all have all their beliefs being true. Like some people's beliefs are true. And that's not true of God either. So this should be false on both intuition and false on the theology. And here are inconsistent statements where they're either true intuitively of people but not of God, in which case you should answer false, or true of God but false of regular people. And these are the ones that we predict on the same logic should cause an inefficiency in processing. Lower accuracy, potentially, higher response time. We were interested in this task as well. I'm going to not really talk much about it, but I'm happy to answer questions later about what might be, if we found it, the kinds of mechanisms that would deal with this conflict. We thought that these might be some kind of an executive selection issue to inhibit an intuitive response to select an alternative. That's some of the evidence from the science literature has suggested that's the case. Speeding manipulation sometimes make it worse for science. There's studies looking at fMRI showing areas of lateral prefrontal cortex involved in these correct solutions of these tasks. So it's plausible to think that those might be involved. In our studies, we haven't ever found any correlates with the results. And so I'll mention that, and I'm not going to talk more about those attempts. So here's an example of the trials, right? God has beliefs that are true. So these are Christian believers, and they're instructed to answer according to what their theology tells them they should say. God has beliefs that are true. Well, yeah, that's fine. It should say true. It's a consistent statement because it's also true of people. People have beliefs that are true. All beliefs God has are false. Well, not true theologically, also not true of regular people. It's false, but it's consistent because the two answers are the same. There's no conflict. Both answers are pointing in the same direction. God has beliefs that are false. False on Christian theology. All God's beliefs are true in Christian theology. But regular people do have false beliefs. So here, if you're activating the person concept where beliefs can be false, and the God concept where beliefs can't be false, there's a conflict. So here we predict it's inconsistent, the correct answer is false. This should be harder for people to respond to. And finally, all belief comes to be true. Yes on theology, no for regular people. Also inconsistent with the answer is true. So these all are items we've created in this way, quads of items created this way. Okay, so that's going to be the basic method. I'm going to talk about a series of studies using this method where we've kind of tried to test a few different things. So I'm mostly going to talk about basic findings, and I've graded these out because these predictions, to give away slightly the punchline, we do find evidence for the inconsistency, the interference, if you like, suggesting that both concepts are activated. But we don't find anything reliable about the extent of the experience being related to measures of executive inhibition, related to differences in the extent of religious engagement or practice. We'll talk about this more. We have got one speeding manipulation, you'll see in a second, that does seem to work. So very briefly, first of our 3 experiments, relatively small sample of community participants. They were recruited from local Christian churches, primarily college students. They're in a small town next to the campus on Santa Barbara, Isla Vista. So it's still a lot of college students, but they were recruited at the churches. And we also have community participants as well, a few of them. About half white, quarter Hispanic or Latinx, 20% Asian. Santa Barbara has a lot of Latinx people, and so we have a lot of Roman Catholics, a lot of non-specified, just Christian, they don't indicate a particular denomination, and some other specific Protestant denominations. On average, they report being moderately religious. One of the things we did here as well, and I think this is, I'm going to put a bid in here for all of us who are cognitive science and psychological scientists, was to undertake with this study a full replication of the Schulman results. So we did all of the 200 science statements that they did and embedded our religious statements in it. So it's not an exact, only untouched, just replicate, we extend without materials, but we do have the opportunity to assess the reliability and the reproducibility of that finding. This is something I think more of us should be doing more regularly as a service to the field of cognitive science in the light of the replication and reproducibility issues that the field has been confronting recently. We were wondering about the extent to which this was an executive selection task, so we used a Stroop-Cavalier task, and then looked also at the how much experience, how often did they go to church? I was wondering whether that would, the more you experience, live with theology, maybe the lower or less the effect of the interference. We did find out on those dimensions. So first of all, for science, we thoroughly replicate Schulman's findings. So Schulman's findings are almost to the exact accuracy levels as well. So the consistent items here are responded to more accurately than the inconsistent items. One of the problems for Schulman a little bit is how low the accuracy of the scientific items is, because it suggests that not everybody knew the science, right? That they might not know that fire isn't matter. Some people do. So it's not clear whether the error is because of the conflict, or whether they just don't know what the answer is. So we actually designed our items to be ones that we were very confident that Christian believers would endorse, would think are true. And so you'll see when I put the results up that the accuracy overall is much, much higher for our items. It was designed that way. We actually designed the items in consultation with priests and people in the religious studies department at UC Santa Barbara to make sure they were not esoteric, weird aspects of theology, and the basic aspects of theology. We had a speeding manipulation. We just basically asked people to go as fast as they could here to see if that would cause more problems, and we didn't find any effect of that manipulation. But we find evidence for the hypothesis. The consistent items are very, very accurately performed, high 90s, and there's a noticeable and reliable drop for the inconsistent items. That's also true under the speeding conditions, but that doesn't make any difference as a manipulation in this study. And we get a similar positive response. Our second experiment is basically a replication of the first one with the extension of making the speeding manipulation a little more robust. So rather than just having people free respond versus ask them to go quickly, we here had a cutoff point. So the participants were essentially given a window in which to respond. So really the accuracy results here are the ones that we're going to focus on most, because we're cutting off people's responses. We essentially looked at how long people took to read them and then gave them that much time plus a standard deviation to that reading time. And then after that, if they hadn't responded, they were timed out. So that was to encourage them to respond faster. And the prediction here would be that this would make it more difficult to resolve the conflict. Or you might resolve it with an error at higher probabilities if you were under pressure. here we again replicate the science findings. The reaction time responses here is not a reliable effect, but we do get the interaction where the unspeeded accuracy cost for inconsistent items is smaller in the unspeeded condition than it is here in the speeded condition. So this is a reliable interaction in the element of the religious cognition. So we replicate the basic findings of study 1. We show the interaction, suggesting that this is some kind of process that people are failing at, that they're not resolving this conflict when they're put under time pressure. But again, we don't find any associations with the measures of inhibition or selection that we chose. Probably because we just chose the simplest and easiest thing that everyone uses. But there's lots of different kinds of inhibition process, and it's probably just the wrong kind. So one final thing in this first series is an experiment just to control for the possibility that this is just something weird about the inconsistent statements. There's something weird about the way they're constructed. They don't read as quickly or as easily, that they're just causing some problem through their content that's unrelated to the fact that they're representing this inconsistency between intuition and the theology. And so what we do here is take half of them and replace the supernatural extraordinary concept with a regular ordinary person. This changes the correct response, because now people should be answering based on whether their intuition, because these entities don't have the supernatural characteristics. But the idea would be that here, if this is about the extraordinary characteristic being true of the supernatural agent and that causing the conflict, these effects should go away when you do it with my priest, right? And that's exactly what we find. So we don't find any evidence that just having these sentences where you swap out the extraordinary entity God with an ordinary priest, you don't get the same effect. So it's about attaching these to a supernatural entity that really has those characteristics. It's not just a feature, a low-level feature of this sentence. So one thing that we noticed in the literature on science, and we used this as an inspiration for this series of studies, as I said, is that Andrew Schulman, in another paper, looked at the sort of lifespan effect of increased knowledge with science over a long period of time. So he looked at adults over the lifespans, and in this study, participants who had been immersed in science through their lives. So he recruited university students who were at the end of a 4-year degree, having taken lots of science classes, and faculty in the humanities and in the sciences who were participants as well, who have been reasoning and thinking about these scientific concepts their whole careers. Maybe they're the ones for whom the scientific knowledge would come more quickly. Right? This would attenuate the interference, is one expectation. So what they found was, in fact, that this doesn't happen. Right? That there was a little bit of evidence in the professors that the interference effect was a little smaller, but it was not a big effect. The general case of people having been familiar with the science concepts for long periods of time across their lifespan, there was no decrease in the cost that you pay to reason about the inconsistent versus the consistent statements. And so from now on, I'm going to, rather than present consistent and inconsistent separately, I'm going to kind of speed things up a little by presenting interference scores, basically, that are calculated for accuracy by taking performance on the consistent and subtracting from performance on the inconsistent, and for response time that way around. So you essentially look at just the difference. It's this magnitude of the effect at each age, for example. We were a little underpowered in this study, but I'll show you another cool analysis that we were asked to do, which are now doing all the time for all the studies that we do in the lab. should all be doing. And I'll say some more about it in a second. So 77 participants across the ages of 18 to 87, community sample. About a third of them were the young adults who were comparable to the samples we've had in our studies up to now. 45% in the middle range and about 25% older adults. So these are the interference scores for accuracy on the left, for religion, top left, accuracy for science on the top right, response time for religion, and response time for science. So this is now not separately plotting consistent and inconsistent, it's just this essentially how much cost you pay on average for inconsistent versus consistent statements. And I hope what you can see there is that these are flat lines, that the size of the effect is moderately big, bigger for science than religion, at least for accuracy, but pretty much flat. And if anything slight, this is not a reliable, significant trend, if anything is going in the other direction. That is, the cost is going up because you get older, not down, which is what you'd expect of people becoming more familiar with the theology after being immersed in and with the theology for 60, 70 years. This is a metaverse analysis. Our reviewers asked us to do this. This is one of the ways you can fix researcher degrees of freedom, where you're making lots of choices about how to trim your data, how to exclude participants, how to carve up the data. And this is like a giant table of, you do every single analysis, right? So we have transforming the responses with no transformation, half a standard deviation, 2.5 standard deviations. So this is like trimming outliers, right? And you just do all the analyses and put all the p-values or Bayes factors you get into giant tables, and what you want to see is that it works however you chose to carve the data, however you chose to usually you only present like one universe. We use this transformation and this cutoff for this way of carving up the data. You present this. And that could be the only one of the only ones that actually gives you the effect. And there's some cool papers showing how with existing data sets that are publicly available, you can find that just changing a whole bunch of degrees of freedom, you can make the effects look really different. What you want to see is that they all work. This is kind of cool, new thing you can do. I know it's probably not new to some people, it's new to me. It was new to me. Again, no associations with our interference scores. We had 3 participants in this. We didn't have anyone who was the equivalent of a kind of professors of theology or teachers of Christian theology, but we did have 3 people who had master's degrees in theology who were teaching in various places, religious school, and youth ministry in the church. And these are the 3 participants. And 2 of the 3 showed an accuracy cost, and all of them showed a response to cost. So to the extent these can be considered people who are experts, because they're teaching theology, they're still showing the effect also. All right. So I just have one more series of studies. I'll get through it pretty quickly because I'm going to tell you about all the different things we did and then just throw all the results up on one. Because it's really just a lot of questions and some inbuilt replications and previous replication. So the last thing we wanted to look at here was to address a question that's been kind of floating around in cognitive development for a while. The idea of why might it be that disembodied minds, these kind of supernatural concepts are so widespread among world religions and more generally across cultures. And there's this hypothesis, Paul Bloom is attached to it, Valerie Kulma and others, that supernatural concepts that involve a separation between minds and bodies are kind of natural, that we're natural intuitive dualists. The idea being that we have mechanisms for reasoning about objects and mechanisms for reasoning about minds and people, and they don't actually speak to each other. They're sort of separate all the way down. That's Bloom's proposal. The other idea is that they're ubiquitous because of the reasons that people like Boyer and Sperber say, that they have this counterintuitive nature, that you actually can't separate minds from bodies because people have bodies, and that there are theories of how you represent agents that start with mechanical properties and then embed psychological properties in those entities. So for them, a disembodied mind that exists outside a body is a counterintuitive concept on this kind of view. And so this boils down to the question of whether or not the template concept that's co-opted for the God concept is a person concept, including spatial and physical properties, or it's just a psychological disembodied. And one reason to care about this is that there are people who argue that the concept of God is based on a disembodied mind concept. It's not a person. You don't think of God as having a body or being physical. It's just a sort of disembodied mind. And so Andrew Stallman and Lindemann in a relatively recent paper show, for example, that when you ask people to just list characteristics that God has or doesn't have, this is a giant sample of 1,500 or so people, people are more likely to attribute psychological characteristics to God than physical or physiological characteristics. And they're quicker to endorse the psychological ones than they are to endorse the physiological or spatial ones, and they're slower to deny the psychological ones and faster to deny the spatial or physiological. So this is suggesting that people don't think that God has spatial properties. If that's the case, we should only get our interference effects for items that have to do with God's psychology. That's the prediction of that theory we And so we weren't able to test that in the existing data item set because we had only a handful of items that had to do with physicality or spatiality. They were mostly to do with perception and psychology. And so we just didn't have enough power in the items to test. So we designed a new set specifically to address this question, where we generated a brand new set of statements to combine with the statements, some of the statements we already had, so we could specifically test the physicality of God in the way that we're testing the psychology of God primarily in those private studies. 4 experiments. This is an under review paper. So we did there's 3 of these on MTS, 1 in a student sample with a collaborator in Hawaii. That's a very, very small sample margin, whether it shouldn't be. So first we ask, to what extent does God co-opt the concept person out of a disembodied mind? And basically, if it's a disembodied mind, we should only see the interference with psychological properties, not the physical and spatial. We pre-registered the second one to replicate this one in a lab sample, a student lab sample. Experiment 3, we were interested in different specific concepts from within Christianity. So we looked at the concept of Jesus and the concept of the Holy Ghost. The idea being that perhaps Jesus would be more likely to be embodied and the Holy Ghost perhaps less than God. We didn't have any specific direction or predictions. And then finally we did the control experiment one more time, substituting an ordinary agent for an extra one. And I'll just tell you right now, that gives us the same results, so we're not worried about that. So just accuracy interference scores here. 2 versions of God in the regular MTEP and the replication, in the blue and the red. God in experiment 3, again with MTEP, and then results for the Holy Spirit and Jesus. And you can see here that this replicates on the right side the psychology results that we've shown up to now. But we see it too from the physical aspects as well. So people are representing God as physical, and they're interfering in the same way and activating the idea that God is a physically embodied person, that the Holy Spirit is a physically embodied entity. So this seems to suggest that the mind-body dualism position, the idea that you're basing the concept of God on just this mind, absent body, isn't supported, at least in this text. Okay, let's see. All right, so I'm going to conclude here. I have a couple of other strands, but what I think I'll do is finish the conclusions and end. And then if you want to hear about the new other things, I'll show them next. So just to summarize, consistent evidence of the notion of an intuitive concept of a person. It's activated when religious adherents activate their God concept, and we can find evidence of them resolving or trying to resolve a conflict. It results in inefficiency when they're making statements, endorsing or rejecting the statements that have that conflict. Extensive experience with theological concepts across a lifetime doesn't seem to attenuate the effect. It says spatial properties of God as well as psychological properties of God, suggesting that it may be about the counterintuitive nature of the concept, not the idea that you just disembodied. So let me skip these really quick. Go to the last page. So thank you very much for inviting me once again. Thanks for your attention. I want to thank my collaborators, Michael Bartlett at ASU now, Spencer, my current student at UCSB, and Adam Cohen, a former student at Hawaii now, members of the labs who helped tell us where we were going wrong along the way, and some of this was research was funded by a grant from the John McCain. Thank you very much.
Do you want to slide through that, or should we repeat it?
Either way, yeah, no, I can do it.
Well, in keeping with our custom here, the first block is given over to the students, and then we open it up to the panel.
Oh, that's very smart. You also have that one faculty member whose name was who always asks.
What's Paul?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, is there anything in your, like, when you're administering these surveys, I know there's like, it's capital G God, right? So, but like, is there anything more to make sure that people are using their own ideas about God rather than, like, if I was reading a survey, and I'm not religious, but I can imagine that if I was reading a survey, I might be inclined to use a more general definition of God if they're talking about what does God do, rather than my own personal view of how God would behave. Right, so is there anything in the survey to, like, use your ideas? This is about your belief in how God works, or?
Well, what we actually instructed them to do was to answer according to what the theology of their religion.
Okay.
So we treated their correct answers as ones that matched the extraordinary capacities of God. Those were the ones that the priests and the Catholic religious scholars and religious studies, that these are all statements that people should endorse as things that we believe in that particular religion. And they were instructed to answer from that perspective. One of the reasons we didn't include atheists, let's say, is that it's very difficult to make sense of what their answers would be. Because maybe God doesn't have beliefs that are all true if you don't think God is a real thing. And so we wanted to select people in who were adherents of this particular religion. Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious with that, what about people who might not believe that their religion says that God has to have beliefs at all? Do you know what I mean? I know, like, in which priest are you going to ask, like, from which denomination? I just could imagine a priest who would not necessarily say that God has beliefs at all. You know?
Right. So what we were trying to avoid was including items that might reflect esoteric aspects of theology. These were designed to be ones that got a kind of a common sense view of God in terms of the religion. So these are priests who they're not theological experts, who were just consulting, saying, like, are these statements that believers who come to your church would think are true? Is this the way that you present the theology?
So did you have any sort of account for differences in denomination?
We don't have enough. We don't even know for a lot of our participants whether they didn't specify. So the Roman Catholics specified very often, and we have a few people who specify Baptist or Lutherans, but most people just say, I'm a Christian. And so we presume that means that there are probably some Protestant denomination, but we didn't always are. There is some really very interesting work by Tanya Lohman at Stanford, who studies charismatic Christians. And charismatic Christians have a theology that actually is much more personified. That their theology is that you actually can hear God speaking to you, and they actually have a set of practices where they get together and have conversations with God. It's almost like a mindfulness thing. And so it's possible, but we don't think very likely, that some participants here are answering with an intuitive response because they actually think that God is like a person who you can have a conversation with. But we don't think it's common among this particular ensemble, even though such traditions do exist. I mean, there's also denominations of so Mormons, for example, God has a body explicitly in the theology. So Ann Taves, who was a collaborator on the Templeton project that when we started doing this work, has some connections with the church, the LDS church in Utah. It might be interesting to look at people with that much more embodied.
Yeah.
So they're clearly very limited in only assessing one group of participants in a very specific religious tradition. Now, our hypothesis is that other religions will construct these concepts in a similar way. But we haven't got any tests using this methodology in any other religious tradition. That's clearly a big limitation.
Cool, thank you.
Great talk, thank you. I had 2 quick questions. So there's great talk for comparing 2 different concepts and how they kind of interact with the individual, but I'm kind of curious about some of the stuff that might be drawn from the individual's relationship to these concepts. So similar to the denomination question, I was wondering if you looked into or might consider looking into whether or not people endorse their priests' views on God. So it's the case that both the Bible, the priest, and the people sitting in the church, when they say God, they're supposing that there is a referent out there that they're referring to, right? So it could be the case that the statements made by the priest, the Bible, or even fellow churchgoers may be inaccurate about God. So in assessing these questions, does God have false beliefs or does God have true beliefs? One has to not just consider whether or not those statements have been made, but whether or not those statements are accurate about the thing being referred to. So could you go into that?
It's certainly possible that the responses we're seeing reflect what we're calling errors, right? Are people who, when they see that question, actually in their individual theology think that God can be wrong. Right? We can't rule that out, but it seems to us very unlikely that that's what's explaining this particular pattern. So that's true for vast numbers of people in this kind of. And you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Then, with regards to the statements about scientific facts that are counterintuitive and hard to embrace, and your comparison of looking at people's experience with those scientific fields for extended periods of time, is it the case that did you look at proximity to the type of question? So, for instance, if I'm an astrophysicist, I'm not likely to be thinking frequently about whether or not fire is made out of matter. But that might be different if I'm an explosives expert or something like that.
Yeah. I didn't do the science, didn't develop the science material. So we used, we were inspired to use that methodology because we thought it would be a good way of getting at this question of coexistence without exploiting the kind of narrative recall methodology that we thought was subject to some of those problems of priming the kind of concept that you then observe. So here we don't have any priming, we're just trying to exploit this idea of what might be a natural conflict that would exist only if people are indeed activating a conflicting concept when being asked about God. They're not being asked about a regular person, they're being asked about God. And so our idea is that that brings to mind that concept. For the science items, while we were inspired by the methodology, there are some concerns with the Stallman items. The accuracy rates vary considerably across the different domains of science. And when accuracy is down at sort of 55, 60%, it's not at all clear to me that these are things that people just know, right? That these are scientific things that and they may not even be scientifically right, some of them. And so Stallman tries to address that in his papers on this by looking at correlations between accuracy and response time. And he finds that when accuracy is higher, response time is a bigger interference effect, suggesting that the ones where people know better, there is that conflict. But it's somewhat troubling because I think some of the accuracy results that he reports are not results of conflicts necessarily, but of people just not being sure. If you're approaching 50% is fine, it doesn't matter. I know it's been a long time since I took a class that taught me that. Maybe I'm not just relying on my intuition, maybe I'm just yes. So we were concerned by that in his methodology initially, which is why we didn't want to use esoteric aspects of theology, which about transubstantiation and the Eucharist and stuff like that, because those are not everybody knows that, right? So we wanted to go for things that were kind of just what we thought in our first pass and was confirmed by our checking. Were kind of just basic tenets. That's our accuracy was deliberately supposed to be up at 90+%, where you be more confident that drops from that consistently on the inconsistent items reflected that inconsistency. That was the logic behind it. We can't be sure. You can never be sure that someone making an error is, I just really think that on any task. Right? Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. In relation to something you just said about perhaps looking at other religions, I was wondering if you had looked at, or if you noticed any difference between across all these studies that you mentioned between men and women. There's a new kind of popular book out by Hector Garcia called Alpha God, which is about basically the prototype of effectively like a male, violent, oppressive sort of referent, and he basically frames all that referent you're pointing to human as that instead, more specific, at least for the three big religions. And I'm just wondering if that intersects with.
We have not looked at it, but that's really interesting. I mean, so the hypothesis is that it's not just an embodied person, but at least according to this, it's an embodied male person.
Right.
I have to think some more about that. That's really interesting. My guess is that to assess the consequences of that, you could probably look at the extent to which people, I don't know what the evidence that this person provides is for that position. People are faster to endorse male typical character. I mean, Stallman looks at applying characteristics. So I don't know whether if you use highly concepts that people assume to be gender, whether you could find evidence. It's a really interesting question, but we haven't looked at any sex differences in this sense.
I like the comparison that you did to Stallman's kind of original 200 items in the various domains of science, because it does suggest that there's some consistency in how people are kind of treating inconsistent at intuitive and more professional levels. And I'm wondering if there's a secularized version of this religion task that's non-scientific. And I'm kind of thinking of like superheroes and fantasy and things like that, where we have these mythical figures that are very personified and very embodied, but have these extraordinary characteristics. And some of them even track their sort of history with a little bit of religion. I'm thinking in particular some mythologies of Norse and Roman gods who had appetites and who had physical forms and so on. And then, sort of the cultural evolution of religion, we get these more abstract concepts of deities. And actually, kind of the history of Superman. He originally couldn't fly, for instance. That was an extraordinary ability he gained later on, retconned in. He started out just leaping a tall building in a single bound, which is useless if you can fly, really. But I'm wondering if you might see this treatment of inconsistent items in kind of a secular mythological domain as well.
I think it's quite possible. I mean, so Barrett and Kyle in their original cognitive psychology group compared God with a supercomputer and some other sort of fictionalized extraordinary entities, and they found some similar patterns. And there's really good work that's been done on the acquisition of concepts of things like omniscience by Jonathan Lane and Henry Wellman at Michigan, and they use novel, extraordinary entities in their studies with kids and looked at how they grasp the notion of someone knowing it. So they're using variants of the false belief. And showing how the trajectory of treating God, you treat God like a regular person as you begin to get better at attributing false beliefs in Smarties tests or something. And then they seem to acquire this additional idea around 4 or 5 that actually God knows everything. So it looks as if they they treat God initially as a regular person and then add the modification. That was a study I actually used to talk about in the first couple of times I talked about this before we had way too many studies. But the cool thing is that they also use a Mr. Smart or Ms. Smart, who is like a regular person, but they know everything. And they essentially treat that novel concept the same way. Although one interesting finding in a recent version of that newer paper, I think they showed that kids reared in religious families understood omniscience for novel omniscient entities earlier than kids raised in the secular, suggesting there's a generalization from what they're hearing about God to the kind of entity that knows everything. That was a couple of years ago now. But they got some more recent stuff on. There's lots of ways you can be omniscient. Omniscient can mean you know everything, but does God know more about fixing your car than a mechanic? Right? So there's sort of the domains, the depth and the breadth of omniscience that Jonathan Lane and his colleagues have been doing some really cool work. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but the novel entities that we have exploring Earth have been exploited by developmental psychologists who often want to test the idea outside of a very specific particular thing about which kids can be knowledgeable.
Thank you.
I'm actually not sure if I'm asking the same question Morgan asked with different words. But I was wondering if when people are thinking about God and you tell them to answer according to their theology, if you could get apart whether they were thinking about God or what their institution says about God, like the institution of the church. And I don't know.
Well, yeah. So most of the items, I think those two would be the same responses, and so yeah. I mean, part of the answer I gave before, which I think is true, is for each individual response, we don't go in and ask people follow-up questions to justify their response. Right? So we could find that some people, when they responded, that actually, yes, they made a mistake according to our coding by saying that God, when the statement all God's beliefs are true, they said no to that. We didn't know for any individual response whether that's because they really believed that or they made an error. But that's true of every response that anyone ever collects behavior, right? Unless you get people to interview people or follow up and say, you really mean that? Or was it just a mistake? And so I think in this case, I don't know that people's individual theologies vary huge amounts from an here. We're talking about these very basic characteristics of God, where if you ask people, can God read minds? 95% of people say yes. And I think that's because they believe that God has those characteristics. I don't know that that is different from their individual beliefs versus what the church tells. I think that those are the same thing. But I'm not going to be able to stand here and say, I know for sure that every single time a person makes an error on this task, it's not because their actual belief is not in line with the theology that Christians say they typically believe. I don't know. I can't prove that for every single person. I think it's unlikely. Yeah.
I'm curious about something in your experiment 3 where you're testing the embodied mind fetish for God or disembodied mind. And one thing that occurs to me is that even if you're thinking about God as a disembodied mind, the next nearest thing to disembodied mind is embodied mind, right? And so you might just expect a smaller priming effect for embodied mind characteristics as well, which then would actually kind of fit your data, because then you just have, instead of having, you'd have both betas different from 0, but those two betas themselves also significantly different, which actually kind of fits the data that you have.
It does, I think, but I think it's the other way, right? So our strongest effects, so here the stronger effect in the psychology, the response time is the other way around. Maybe I was trying to save you all the graph. So we do get a slightly bigger effect here for psychology than for psychology. That's certainly possible. So a strong version of the disembodied mind version would say you get no. I mean, Stallman's claims here in this test of this hypothesis are that it's much, much rarer for participants to attribute physical and physiological characteristics to God, and they take longer to do it. So you're right, that this could be we could end up seeing, if we had big enough power, large enough power, a very small difference between these. We don't see any hint of an effect by domain in any of the analysis.
Okay, it looks different to me from here, but this is just looking at a graph.
Yeah. Yes.
And I'm being open to the fact.
So I'm probably that faculty that always asks questions. I guess what I'm getting from the research you present, both your own and the ones you cite, is kind of just a general trend that it's harder to store and utilize beliefs about concepts for which you don't have tangible embodied evidence or experience with. Whether it's things like fire is made of matter, well, I'm familiar with matter, I can see it and I can feel it. Fire is something I can see and feel, so it must be made of matter. And something like God, God is, we talk about God as using the same words we with, for people. I wonder though, if it is just an experience effect. So I actually have two questions about this. One is, I wonder if you could actually get rid of all this effect if you allowed people to, let's say, spend a week playing a video game in which there was a character of God that had all these characteristics and none of the characteristics of embodied humans. Right? And then say, well, now answer all these questions about God being the entity in the video game you've just been playing. And therefore you have direct experience with something that has just these characteristics. Right? So now you have an analogy that's direct rather than something separate. And I guess just the other question I had was, where do you see all this work in the larger work on, let's say, the evolution of religion in terms of functional explanations for religion? Like, why do we believe, like, moralizing gods and such? Like, what's the point anyway of believing in certain things about God versus others? And does it matter if we believe that God is embodied or not for the function of religion?
Okay, if I can answer the second one first. I think this is entirely compatible with the functional approaches to people like Lorenzo and so one of the things that predicts cooperative behavior is believing in a God that knows everything. Yeah. Right? A God that and a God who's willing to punish if you do the wrong thing. So they have quite a lot of evidence now, including from across a bunch of traditional societies where there are local and moralizing gods, where that's what predicts kind of anonymous giving to in-group members. And so I don't see the third study is perhaps more esoteric. It has to do with what might be the concept on which the God concept in these religions is based. And so I care probably more about that than anyone else. I mean, that is to say, it's a weird thing to care about. Right? Because it just has to do with the kind of intricate developmental psychological theory that Paul Bloom has, that we're natural dualists, which I don't think is based on good evidence at all. I think a much better understanding of animate agency is one that says that animate agents are mechanical agents, and then they have other properties as well. So we don't treat people as non-objects at any point in development. So that's the reason why we did that other study. And so I don't think this is totally divorced from theories of religion. However, I also don't think that Boyer is right, and I don't think he actually ever claimed this. He didn't do himself any favor by calling his book Religion Explained, but I don't think he actually believes that this is all there is to explaining the ubiquity of these kinds of these cultures. It's very clear that just concepts with certain kinds of concepts that might have a memory or transmission advantage does not explain what people believe in God, right? That has to do with cultural support, and it has to do with the functions of those gods. And so I think that understanding how we represent something like omniscience is an interesting question, and I do think that this is consistent with that and not inconsistent with it. So I think it fits. To your first question, if I have it right, it's we just haven't given them the right kind of experience. So if we train them,
I'm saying the world hasn't given people the right.
Right. Okay. Well, no, that's fair enough. We have a shot at that in our second study. I mean, we have people who've been immersed in Christian theology for 60 years, right? And it's a proxy for experience, but maybe it's not good enough. So I'd be happy to do that. I mean, I don't actually think that that would actually change things. I would be happy to make the prediction that after doing what you just said, you'd still find these interferences. Because I do think this is how we build those concepts. I don't think it's just about being kind of unsure about them. Religious beliefs are very sure about the.
No, I'm just saying in terms of experience, like if you could create an experience where people sort of had something concrete to draw an analogy to. Right? If it's really just like when I was a college student, I took quantum physics, and I still can't understand what the hell is happening in an atom, right? No matter how many years of quantum physics. Right?
The Institute of Theoretical Physics at UC Santa Barbara, they took gobbledygook.
Yeah. But if I could sort of create like an atom simulator and play it, 10 hours a day, then maybe you start drawing it. I guess what I'm saying is, what I'm really saying is what's different from this and just any situation where we use words where it's difficult to draw an analogy from concrete experience. Is there a difference between religious beliefs and anything where the words don't have something tangible to draw an analogy to?
Well, I think that what I think is causing this is I'm not sure that this is all just intangible, because I think it is important that these are concepts that represent they are representations of entities that have specific kinds of violations that go against core knowledge and expectations you have. There are things that are concrete and exist in the world that might be thought of as intangible. So I don't think it's that, and it's an empirical question. Right? You'd have to design an experiment along the lines of the one that you suggested, and give people all of that experience, train them, give them those tangible experiences, and then ask them specific questions about what they think about it. My prediction would be if you're trying to teach them about something that they had to construct, by taking a concept that was familiar to them and modifying it in some way, the only way that they would think about that concept would be in reference to that pre-existing concept, and you would find evidence that that was activated, even after 2 weeks in your fancy.
Okay, I guess the latter thing is, I agree with that. And, well, I'll let someone else answer.
I mean, no, it's not wrong that we can end up being wrong, right? I mean, we're supposed to be wrong, and so someone else will make us right eventually.
I'm not suggesting you're wrong. I'm just
Oh, I'm almost certainly wrong. I mean, I go into everything assuming that I'm going to be wrong. I'm happy to be wrong, because it means when we discover why and how, we know more. I'm honest, that's true. But so an empirical question is a good question, and it's good if we can find a way of testing whether that position is right or the position I'm advocating is right. Let's do it. I think that experience wouldn't change it, but I could be wrong.
I'm thinking about whales. I imagine that if you ask people to confirm mammalian properties of whales, that they would be slower, they'd have more difficulty than if you ask them to confirm fish-like properties of whales. It has nothing to do with intangibles, they're all very tangible things. Now, one explanation is that fish is part of our core conceptual vocabulary, and fish becomes active when we think about whales. But there are a class of theories that would say, no, it's really about the similarities between this whale thing and other things I have experience with, like fish. I guess good examples come from like the word reading literature, where there's interesting theories about the neighborhoods, the similarity neighborhoods of words and how people respond to them faster or slower. So I'm trying to see whether similarly here, there's evidence that really says that there is this activation of a person concept, or whether the concept of God overlaps with the person concept in enough ways, has enough similarity that you get these kinds of similarity effects that produce interference.
Okay, well, the whale case. So whale, that would be an example, I think, of one of the domains that Stillman tested, where he would not use the same terminology as I have known to talk about the intuitive versus the scientific theories. He talks about early acquired versus late acquired. So I think he'd be very comfortable to say, well, yeah, our first theory of a whale, not a core knowledge theory driven by some evolved system of learning, but just the first experiences we had is, yeah, whales are fish. Think of them as fish, and it comes as a surprise to many of us that they're not. But once we learn that, we revise and change. I think you're right. So I think that would be something that would fit into these items, and it would just be an early versus late theory in his ideas. The early theory isn't replaced by the late theory. That's how he would account for it. It could also be something to do with the overlap in concepts. With respect to the second issue, does God just overlap a lot with the person concept? Well, yeah, but I think the idea is it doesn't come out when people are given plenty of time just to articulate the concepts of God. If you ask people, and this actually is a study that I think Stillman did again in 2008, where you ask parents, adult participants, and then in another study, parents and their kids, to just describe characteristics which apply to God. And it turns out that adult religious believers do not explicitly attribute large numbers of personal characteristics to God. Kids do many more. So in that sense, religious concepts differ from other fictional supernatural concepts like vampires and zombies and things like that. And so the concept overlap theory would also need to have added to it why the results look different when the tasks are like these more implicit, speeded responses. Right? So people don't have to respond fast in all of our studies. We identify these cases where there's an inefficient responding, but it doesn't come out when you just ask people what the theology is. So if it was just that the concepts overlap a lot, it's not obvious to me that would give you that same result. You would get people listing a lot of these concepts in the explicit tasks as well. But it may be that there's some other element to that theory that could explain why you get this difference, and that would then be another viable theory that we would have to try and find a way of deciding between that version and this version. And again, I'm probably wrong.
Thank you.
So I've just been fixated on the fire thing and the
Fires
accuracy
matter?
score. Fires matter, yeah.
I'm not even sure that it isn't.
Well, right. You hear fire.
We should change that example.
Yeah, and how much of that's due to that? Because, you know, there's gases.
No, I
and
think
carbon.
for Stolman's cases
Yeah.
it really is, and
Yeah.
so I think with those, and yeah, so the more you look into those items, the methodology, the logic of the methodology is great, but there's some problems with at least some items in all of the different domains, and it's also not clear to me that things that are being identified by Stolman as the scientifically correct version are in fact the scientifically correct version for all items. I think on average they're right, but if I go back and show you the accuracy, right, even for the consistent items with these science, they're like 80-something%. So people just don't know much about science.
So I was thinking if you took the fire one out, because depending on how it's asked, it seems
It's not just
obviously
the fire one.
wrong. Okay, all right.
There are a lot of items
All right.
in there where the accuracy for the English, it's down like here, it's down like 60%. So there, I think you're at a point where, so that how do you know whether people really think God in their theology does have false beliefs? Right? I said, I don't know for sure for every participant, but the consistency, the accuracy of it is still pretty high. And I think that in that sense, our items for the religious concepts are better than Stolman's items for the science. Because I think we took pains to make sure these would be items that people who believe in this tradition would endorse as part of the theology.
There were 80 items, is that right? For some
There
science?
were, in this third study, 80, 40 physical and 40 perceptual and psychological, which we kind of treated together.
And
They're
then
just interesting.
The 40 were evenly divided between the 10 for the 4 cases?
Yeah. Yeah, each one, we always create them in these kind of quadrant ways. Because of course you're doing a response time study, so you want them to be read about the same number of syllables, and all of that stuff is as well controlled as it can be. And certainly there are no systematic differences between the consistent and the inconsistent items, or things like length, complexity, syllables, like that. And then we do the priest condition to check that it's not anything like that. So when you take God out and substitute priest, the effects will control. So it really is about representing the concept that is allegedly bringing to mind a person concept that is modified.
And with that, we're probably wrong, but let's definitely thank our speaker because we ran out of time. So